I'm Casey Wheatland. I'm assistant professor here. I teach political science courses focusing on political philosophy and American government. I hope you're not sick of seeing me up here. But I brought a prop with me this time. I brought a book, and one that you all have. We gave you copies of this, the Federalist Papers. The copy that you had was a red cover, but it's otherwise the exact same as the one that I have up here. And I want to start with a poll. Raise your hand if at any point in your life you have ever read any of the essays in the Federalist Papers. If you've read at least one of them in your life. All right, just about everyone in here. Keep your hand up, keep your hand up. All right, keep your hand up if you have read Federalist 10 and Federalist 51. A few hands went down, but still, I'd say about half of the room. Keep your hand up if you have read all 85 of them. We few. We brave few. This is a book that we are both very familiar with and yet at the same time not familiar with. And in fact, we usually do not treat it as a book. We treat it as a series of essays, which of course is what it was in its origin. Right? 85 essays written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, published in New York newspapers in 1787 and 1788 in order to convince the people of New York to adopt the Constitution. And so we have these 85 essays written under a shared pseudonym Publius, yet written by 3 different authors. And so we could read these essays individually, and typically when we are teaching American civics, we will look to the essays that deal with the principles of constitutionalism, separation of powers, managing factions, checks and balances, maybe looking at the particular arrangement of Congress, the courts, and the presidency. But I'm going to argue that we can also look at this as a comprehensive work. A comprehensive work not simply on constitutionalism as such, or on the American Constitution, but on political science of political life. And even though these are 3 different authors, and ones that are going to have differences with each other over the course of their careers, right? Hamilton and Madison, famously, although they both support the ratification of the Constitution, they are going to go their separate ways in the 1790s. If you look at the history of American politics as a history of great debates, you could say that the first debate is the question of whether or not to declare independence. The second debate is the debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Really, I think the third great debate is the Pacificus-Helvidius debates, which is a debate between Alexander Hamilton and James Madison after the Constitution has been ratified. And it is a debate over the scope of executive powers in the field of foreign affairs. Yet, I believe that despite the fact that there are 3 authors to this work, it can be read in a coherent, unified way, as a book. And Alexander Hamilton, the man who wrote most of these essays, believed this. Before the ink was dry in the final essays, in fact, before the final essays were even published in New York newspapers, Hamilton made the effort to bind the essays together, all 85 of them, into a 2-volume book. And by the time that he did this, the ratification of the Constitution was almost a moot point. It was very obvious, I think, at this point that they were going to get at least 9 of the 13 states to ratify this, and it was clear that the people of New York specifically were going to ratify it. And so Hamilton did not simply bring this together as a book for the sake of fulfilling that immediate task of getting the people to ratify the Constitution. It seems that he had another purpose in mind, a higher, more fundamental purpose. And Hamilton was not the only person that believed that. Thomas Jefferson and George Washington also believed that this work contains certain fundamental universal truths about the nature of politics. By the way, we tend to call this book today the Federalist Papers. When Hamilton published these initially, it was called simply the Federalist. That suggests more of a unity in a way. Jefferson and Washington both saw this as well. Jefferson, in a letter to James Madison, said that this was the book that best expressed the principles of politics, the principles of government. George Washington, in a beautiful letter to Alexander Hamilton, said that when this crisis of the ratification of the Constitution goes away, most of the essays and pamphlets that were written will be forgotten, but that this work will remain for all times, so long as you have people who are interested in preserving political liberty. And so I'm going to argue that if we read this book in a unity, if we read it coherently as a book rather than simply a series of essays that we pick and choose, there's going to be a through line here that gives us a more comprehensive civic education, one that I think and believe that our students should know. And I'm going to argue that the through line here is the relationship between reason, liberty, and justice. In Federalist 53, Madison notes that the various state constitutions provide for different term lengths for their legislative assemblies. In Connecticut and Rhode Island, members of the lower chamber held office for 6 short months, while in South Carolina they held office for 2 years. Despite this difference, though, he says, it would not be easy to show that Connecticut or Rhode Island is better governed or enjoys a greater share of rational liberty than South Carolina. Rational liberty. Here in a phrase, Madison reveals the purpose of government according to the founders. It is not simply liberty that they sought, but rational liberty. That is to say, a form of liberty that is reasonable, that conforms to the human good. In Federalist 9, Hamilton remarked in horror that the history of the petty republics of Greece and Italy is a history of perpetual vibration between the extremes of tyranny and anarchy. The American founders aimed for a happy mean between tyranny and anarchy, or as Leo Strauss once brilliantly put it, the creation of an order which is not oppression with freedom which is not license. And so I want to understand that relationship between reason, liberty, and justice. And let us begin with reason and try to understand what that means and its limits. In Federalist 31, Publius takes a break from his main narrative. And if you read the Federalist cover to cover, by the time you get to the late 20s, it gets kind of boring. I'm not going to lie. That's kind of the low point of the text in terms of capturing the reader's attention. And I think Hamilton might have even been boring himself at this point. He's writing these papers, these essays so quickly. The editors of these newspapers are writing back to him saying, please slow down. Our readers are sick of seeing Publius all the time. And Hamilton takes a step back here in number 31 and makes a more philosophical point. He says, in disquisitions of every kind, there are certain primary truths or first principles upon which all subsequent reasonings must depend. These contain an internal evidence, which, antecedent to all reflection or combination, commands the assent of the mind. Human beings are capable here of axiomatic logic. And this is a point that Dr. Gish had brought out in his account of John Quincy Adams and the Declaration of Independence. Echoing Euclid here in Federalist 31, Publius notes that geometry begins with self-evident truths. The whole is greater than the part. Two things equal to the same thing must also be equal to each other. Two straight lines cannot enclose a space, etc. This mode of reasoning applies to moral as well as physical nature. Publius continues. He says, of the same nature are these other maxims in ethics and politics, that there cannot be an effect without a cause, that the means ought to be proportioned to the end, that every power ought to be commensurate with its object, that there ought to be no limitation of a power destined to effect a purpose which itself is incapable of limitation. These are, in a way, Euclidean propositions or axioms for a political geometry. Many moral and political truths, Publius then says, that are not strictly axiomatic can be inferred from these axioms by what he says are the natural and unsophisticated dictates of common sense. And so human beings, we are political animals. Because we are endowed with reason, we can understand these things. We can express notions of justice and injustice, ethics and politics, right and wrong, advantage and disadvantage within a community with other human beings. Publius's conception here of nature and reason is classical. Man has the capacity to recognize certain axioms, first principles, that without antecedent evidence move the mind and serve as the foundation for higher order thought. In the same manner that Euclid's system of geometry begins with certain propositions undeniable to a sound mind, our capacity for politics also begins with certain self-evident truths. Yet, axiomatic reasoning can only take us so far. Politics, like mathematics, begins with fundamental truths, but unlike mathematics, it is a theoretical science. I'm sorry, mathematics is a theoretical science. Politics is not. It is a practical science. It is meant to guide human action and therefore must account for the changeability and variety of human activity. Right? Geometric equations do not change. 2 + 2 always equals 4. But human life and circumstances do change. In Federalist 55, Publius notes the distinction between theoretical and practical science. He says here, nothing can be more fallacious than to found our political calculations on arithmetical principles. And here he is talking about the question of how many representatives should we have in the House of Representatives. Publius is going to make the point there's no magic number. There's certain considerations that we have to take in mind, and certain things, certain circumstances which may change. There's no magic number, 50, 100, 1,000, that will solve that problem for all time. We instead have to look to human experience. We can observe cause and effect, and we can reason from experience, both our own experience and also from historical experience. In Federalist 20, Publius calls experience the oracle of truth. The greatest experience that one can attain besides the actual practice of statesmanship is the careful study of history and regimes. And throughout these essays, Publius masterfully employs both examples of ancient and modern regimes alongside axiomatic abstract reasoning to justify and explicate the Constitution. And so human beings can understand cause and effect. We have the foundations for higher order thought. And we're going to see that this is what makes us capable of attaining liberty. Now, when the founders spoke of rational liberty, they did not mean what today we might call scientific rationalism. They recognized that it was impossible to form a perfect human society through the exercise of the rational mind. And they believed that attempts to do so would end in catastrophe. Federalist 6, which is one of my favorite ones, Publius warns that a man must be far gone in utopian speculations if he expects that neighboring states will not go to war with one another on account of their shared dedication to republican principles. And Publius says it is in the true interest of all nations to cultivate peace and friendship with one another, but those who expect nations to follow their interests at all times in this peaceful way are going to be left with a disappointing surprise. When Alexander Hamilton in later writings would refer to the French revolutionaries as fanatics in political science, he meant that they grossly overestimated the capacity to conform human beings to abstract theories of government, and that they grossly underestimated the extent to which the passions cloud our judgment and complicate the art of ruling. They did not understand, in other words, the distinction between practical and theoretical knowledge and the relation between the two. Hamilton and the other founders believed that it was unreasonable to assume that human beings would always act reasonably. And so throughout the Federalist, Publius is careful to never expect too much from human reason. We have the potential for reason, but we do not always exercise that potential fully. And this is because we also have other elements of our nature. Right, if you study the classical accounts of human beings, of the human soul in Plato or Aristotle or other sources, right, Plato and Aristotle divide the human soul into distinct parts. There is a rational element to our souls and a non-rational element. Right? We're not simply brains in jars. We have the will and we have appetites. And something that's interesting about the Federalist is that the Federalist very rarely mentions the human soul. The word, in both its singular and plural form, only appears thrice in these 85 essays. Yet, these different parts of the soul that Plato or Aristotle recognize are actually here in Publius's writings. We have human reason, and then we also have the will and the appetites. And the will and the appetites appear constantly throughout these essays under the term passions and interests. Right? Human beings have passions, we have emotions, and we also have certain interests, desires, right? Appetites. And these things, combined with our reason, make for a comprehensive account of our nature. And the passions and interests, the will and the appetites, are dangerous in some ways. They can be conformed to reason, but they're not automatically conformed to reason. They have to somehow be made conformable. The passions are not always detrimental to human flourishing, but they are certainly a danger. And this is where Publius then begins to think about the nature of justice. And justice, we'll see, comes about through the emergence of law. Publius says in Federalist 49 that it is the reason alone of the public that ought to control and regulate the government. The passions ought to be controlled and regulated by the government. And then in Federalist 15, he says, why has government been instituted at all? Because the passions of men will not conform to the dictates of reason and justice without constraint. Right? In other words, for self-government to work, for self-governance to operate at a societal level, the reason of the public, the collective reason of the society, has to be made to control the collective passions of the society. Self-government does not mean here that we as individuals or as a society simply can do whatever we want, but rather that we are directed to act reasonably. In Federalist 63, Madison, in his discussion of the Senate, is going to say that we need this institution in order to instill a cool and deliberate sense in the community. Right? Madison is going to say that self-government does not mean the community does whatever it wants, but rather that it's the cool and deliberate sense of the community that guides it. In other words, the community, the people at their best, us at our most reasonable. Law here, in Publius's understanding, is a precept of reason. Its intention is to exact obedience from citizens who, because of our disordinate passions, might otherwise fail to abide by the demands of reason. And we'll see that the demands of reason and the demands of justice are the same or more or less the same for Publius. By taming the passions and bringing them into accordance with reason, law makes rational liberty possible. The alternative to the rule of law is either anarchy or tyranny. Without the influence of reason and moral virtue, human beings can only coexist under a tyrannical government that keeps order through raw force. And this is a point that Publius makes at the very end of Federalist 55. He says, in essence, that if you want republican government, if you want self-government, then you must assume that there is some element of virtue and some element of good in human nature that can overcome those things that are evil and disordinate in human nature. And Madison really drives his point home and says that if that does not exist, then the only alternative you have are the shackles of despotism. Law is possible because of human reason, but it is necessary because of human depravity. By enjoining reason with force, law makes possible not only political liberty, but also justice. And Publius references justice many, many times throughout the Federalist. And I cannot go through all those times because we would be here probably until the next Socratic stage event. But Publius actually never defines justice. He tells us in number 51 that it is the end of government, but he takes for granted that his American audience already knows what justice means. But if you take the dozens of passages in which Publius discusses justice and injustice, it's clear that he understands justice to be the virtue of proper social relations. Injustice occurs when one party reaches beyond what they are rightly owed. Right? Justice occurs when each is given what is their proper due. This is ultimately the classical conception of justice. Justice then requires obedience to just laws and just rulers. In a word, it requires obedience to reason. And this is the task of the Constitution, is to fulfill this, instill this obedience to reason. Publius says in number 51 that in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place oblige to control itself. Laws have to be framed that lend sufficient force and public support to the government. Now, how can we do this? Well, Publius gives us an answer in Federalist 17. He tells us why it is that human beings would willingly give their support to the laws. And he gives us two reasons why. One is through proximity, the natural affection that occurs with the things that we are familiar with, as we heard from Jeanette Richard this morning. We could call this friendship. That could be another word for this, right? Familiarity, or it's friendship. The second reason that we might lend our voluntary support for the laws is because of the good administration of ordinary civil and criminal justice, right? We see that the laws are protecting us. And so we have these two poles here, friendship and justice. This, by the way, is what Aristotle says makes political communities possible. In Book 8 of the Nicomachean Ethics and in many other places, friendship and justice. But who should the people obey? Who should be tasked with creating these laws? Federalist 57 gives us the answer to that question. Publius says the aim of every political constitution is, or ought to be, first to obtain for rulers men who possess the most wisdom to discern and the most virtue to pursue the common good of society. And in the next place, to take the most effectual precautions for keeping them virtuous while they continue to hold their public trust. And so far from simply channeling passions or countering power with power, checking ambition with ambition, the Constitution is ultimately designed to guard and promote public virtue by bringing together political authority and political wisdom, elevating the rule of those among us who are most intelligent, most talented, most virtuous, and most moral. And I won't go through all of this, but Federalist 35 is one of these interesting and overlooked essays that I think most clearly explains the mechanism by which this occurs. Here, Publius turns to a discussion of economics. He says there's a certain harmony of interest that emerges between the different elements of your economy. Farmers, manufacturers, tradesmen, merchants. And Publius says this natural harmony of interest will exist so long as the government is not arbitrarily taxing one element of society to the benefit of another. And so Hamilton says if you have a proper system of political economy, people are not going to simply vote for the person that belongs to their same profession. They're going to vote for their neighbors who they trust to be the most talented, virtuous, and wisest among them. And Hamilton says that in this arrangement, the learned professions will be elevated to high office. Now, what are these learned professions? He never actually tells us exactly, but we can, I think, make some guesses. For one thing, what is Hamilton himself? He is a lawyer. Madison is a lawyer. John Jay is a lawyer. It seems that lawyers are going to represent a plurality, or at least a very large section of these learned professions. We can imagine that teachers and professors might also constitute this part of the learned profession. Right? Noah Webster was a teacher. James Wilson was a professor. John Witherspoon was a college president while he was serving in the Continental Congress. In other words, the constitutional order opens the door for those with a liberal education to take the reins of power. These men, on account of their wisdom, learning, and virtue, will be the most trustworthy guardians of the law and justice. And so just as liberty in and of itself is not the purpose of government, but rather it's rational liberty, a reasonable liberty, a government by majority rule does not suffice for legitimacy. The founders sought the rule of the people, but the rule of the people at their best, the rule of our reason, not our passions. To come back to number 63, Publius says, what bitter anguish would not the people of Athens have often escaped if their government had contained so provident a safeguard against the tyranny of their own passions? Popular liberty might then have escaped the indelible reproach of decreeing to the same citizens the hemlock on one day and statues on the next. Notice that phrase, the tyranny of passions. This is the great stumbling block that we must overcome. And the founders attempted to overcome this by framing a constitution that would elevate public reason and reasonable men. To conclude, Publius recognizes that man is a political animal because we are endowed with reason. Our reason makes political liberty possible, but it is unreasonable to expect that human beings will act perfectly reasonable. Liberty becomes reasonable when reason rules over our passions. Good laws ensure that public reason rules over the public passions. This is accomplished through institutional arrangements that elevate reason in the public mind and reasonable men to ruling office. The rule of these gentlemen through law is the closest practical approximation that we have to the rule of wisdom in and of itself. Law not only establishes rational liberty, but also justice. And justice, in turn, preserves and ennobles the political order. That, in essence, is the political teaching of the Federalist. And it is, in its essence, a classical account of politics, and one that our students and our fellow citizens should come to know in order to become better citizens. Thank you.
Join us in falling in love with America again.